Today, we're going to tackle a story that really challenges our easy definitions of good and evil, of victim and perpetrator. We're going to get into the incredibly complicated case of Aileen Wuornos.
All right, let's just jump right in with a question that gets to the absolute heart of this thing. How on earth does the story of a convicted murderer get so compelling that it ends up being celebrated with an Oscar? You know, it's a wild thought, and it's totally central to understanding this entire case.
So, the person at the center of this whole cultural storm is Aileen Wuornos. And look, the basic fact is not up for debate. She was convicted of killing multiple men. But the story? Well, as you're about to see, it is anything but simple.
And the public's fascination, it was just immense. I mean, her case wasn't just some news headline that faded away. No, it exploded into a full-blown cultural phenomenon. We're talking tons of books, acclaimed plays, a huge award-winning film, and get this, even an opera. When something gets that much attention, you know there's something much, much deeper going on than your typical true crime story. So that brings us right to the core question we're digging into today. What is it about Aileen Wuornos that just blurs all the lines and forces us to deal with these really uncomfortable moral questions? All right, let's break it down.
First things first, we have to look at the initial and honestly, the simplest reason she became so famous or infamous.
A huge piece of the puzzle, right from the start, was her gender. The media loved calling her the first female serial killer. Now, that's not technically accurate, but she was a total, shocking anomaly. A woman who was violently doing things that, in the public mind, were almost exclusively done by men. And when you actually put it side by side like this, the contrast is just, wow, it's stark. The typical profile, right? It's male. The motive is often sexual. The victims are usually women. Wuornos, she just flipped every single one of those scripts. She was female, her victims were all men, and her motive, at least the one she claimed, wasn't sexual at all. It was something else entirely.
And that brings us to the first major complication, the first big crack that just breaks that simple female monster story wide open.
See, here's the thing. She didn't just stand up and say, "I didn't do it." Her defense brought a whole new narrative to the table, one that was deeply unsettling and made people look at her entire life, not just the crimes she committed. She talked about a lifetime of horrific sexual abuse. She argued that the men she killed weren't random victims. They were men who were actively trying to assault her. And suddenly, this wasn't just a simple defense. It raised these profound questions about responsibility. I mean, where does the blame lie for someone who has been a victim over and over again? And then this detail came out. A truly stunning revelation. That first man she killed, he was, in fact, a convicted rapist. And that one single fact lent this disturbing credibility to her whole story, and it completely complicated the public's idea of her as just some cold-blooded killer.
Okay, so this all leads us to a much broader way of trying to understand her actions, through the psychological framework of something called battered person syndrome.
Her story, you see, it didn't just exist in a vacuum. For a lot of observers, especially feminist social critics, her case wasn't just about one woman's awful actions. They saw it as this tragic, real-world example of a well-documented psychological condition.
And that condition is battered person syndrome. It's basically a psychological reaction that can happen when someone endures repeated, terrible brutality. Now, in a courtroom, this is a pretty controversial defense because our idea of self-defense usually requires an immediate threat, right? BPS argues that for someone who's constantly abused, the threat is always there. It's persistent. It's not trying to excuse the murders, not at all, but it tries to explain the mindset that could lead to them. So, you've got all these competing ideas swirling around. How did her story finally get cemented in our collective memory? What's the lasting image? Well, for a lot of people, the answer is the 2003 movie Monster. And this wasn't your typical crime flick. It was a deep character study that made a very bold choice. It told a story from her point of view. And in doing that, it basically solidified this image of a deeply, deeply complicated person.
The movie didn't try to hide what she did, but it absolutely framed her as, well, as one critic put it, as someone abused by everyone and who deserved a certain amount of sympathy. It made the case right there on screen that maybe, just maybe, condemnation and sympathy could exist in the very same person.
And that leaves us right here. The story of Aileen Wuornos doesn't give us any easy answers. It's not supposed to. Instead, it forces us to ask a really difficult and, I think, an enduring question.
in a life that's been defined by both committing and receiving just brutal violence. Where exactly do you draw the line between monster and victim?